a disease of wicked proportion. Love of money and gold. Its cure will never be had. This is what I've been told. This is what
My name is Lauren Regan. I'm an attorney in Eugene, and I run the Civil Liberties Defense Center, which is a nonprofit that represents radical activists in progressive social change movements, as well as educating those movements of what their rights are, watchdogging federal legislation that comes down the pike that affects First Amendment rights. And primarily, I think the reason I was asked to give this presentation today is I represented a number of radical activists who were affiliated with the Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front on what has been called the Green Scare prosecutions. And we call it the Green Scare, hearkening back to the Red Scare of the 1950s, because a lot of the same tactics that were used during that era of government repression have come back. And instead of targeting communists as the philosophy that had garnered government ire, now it is anarchism, non-capitalism, anti-capitalism, as well as environmentalists and animal rights activists. And we've seen this manifesting itself in hundreds of federal grand juries that have taken place around the country, many of which have resulted in innocent people who have been imprisoned for months for resisting those grand juries, as well as a number of people who have been prosecuted and sentenced upward of 20 years in prison for crimes that normally carry a 2-year prison sentence. And just to make that very clear, some of my clients, to give you an example, Jonathan Paul was accused of burning down a horse slaughterhouse facility in Eastern Oregon. This was a Dutch corporation who was buying the wild mustangs from the West. The BLM, Bureau of Land Management, takes helicopters and raises these wild mustangs into corrals, the mothers, babies, perfectly healthy wild mustangs, puts them onto trains and trucks and ships them to these slaughterhouse facilities. About 1/3 of the horses die on the journey because of the overcrowded conditions, and the other 2/3 are systematically executed in an incredibly painful and horrific way. And if you know anything about horses, they're very intelligent, and so while they're lined up for their final demise, they hear the other horses screaming and suffering, and they all start freaking out. And it's just a horrific place. And they were paying people below minimum wage. There were lots of worker injuries that were occurring at the slaughterhouse facility. And so a group of people, including local people, had attempted to shut the facility down. They'd written letters, they'd done all the above ground things that anyone could ever do. And when the horses continued to be slaughtered, a group of young people stealthily in the night went, ensured that there was no humans or animals that would be harmed, and burned the place down, and it was never rebuilt. He was prosecuted along with 15 other people in 2006 for a series of arsons. The one that he was involved in took place in 1997, and our system of laws says that after 5 years they can't prosecute you anymore. The trail goes dead, so to speak. But what the government did was a new nifty little trick. They reached back and they said, well, all these people and all these different arsons that took place from 1997 to 2002 are all connected. They all used that ELF or ALF moniker, so they must all know each other, and this is a big conspiracy. They're just not telling us that they're card-carrying ELF members, but we know they must have cards. And so they said as long as there wasn't a 5-year gap between all of these crimes, they could go back as far as they wanted and reinvigorate those crimes that would have otherwise been unprosecutable. And Jonathan was one of the victims of that new little tactic that they pulled out. So like I mentioned, normally in the federal system, arson carries a 2-year prison sentence. My clients who were charged with arson were facing life plus 1,115 years in prison for the exact same crime. And the reason that there was such a disparity in their punishments was because they were targeting political activity that the government was threatened by, whereas other people who commit arson are just greedy. You know, it's insurance fraud or trying to kill your girlfriend in their mobile home, or, you know, whatever the reason. Theirs was narcissistic and self-focused, whereas these people, you know, could potentially become popular. Their ideas might become popular. And especially because the corporations primarily are running our government, they were very threatened at the idea of these people taking on meat and animal rights issues. Genetically modified and genetically engineered crops were also a target, as well as federal land management practices like clear-cutting the last of our forests, and, you know, like I mentioned, that horse issue, the grazing issue on our public lands. So that's kind of the background to how I sort of came into talking about these issues. As a lawyer, you know, we have this concept of equal justice, you know, that like crimes should be treated in a like manner. And so if 2 years was what my clients should have been facing, and all of a sudden they're facing 1,115 years, something was not quite right in our system of government and the system of laws that were set up for them. And it became a battle, really a political battle, over the word terrorism. You know, these prosecutions, like I said, they took place between 97 and 01, and this was all pre-9/11. But in 2005, they're still hunting for Osama bin Laden. They can't find him anywhere, but all of a sudden they catch these bunny huggers through the use of informants, and they were nonviolent and easy to catch, and so they became the terrorists. They did it in the media. We had U.S. Attorney Alberto Gonzales taking national media and calling them eco-terrorists. And the corporations, of course, were all too happy to join in on that bandwagon. And so we sort of had a spin doctor battle between the bastardization of the English language. You know, the government calling, you know, a kettle a soup spoon, and we were all supposed to believe that the kettle was now a soup spoon. The idea of property crimes and economic sabotage, which had been tactics used in the U.S. since the creation of our democracy, were now being labeled as terrorist crimes, the same as humans who flew planes into buildings and intended to kill thousands of humans. There had always been a distinction between that. Now, interestingly, if you looked on every law book that exists, you won't find a crime called terrorism. There is no crime of terrorism in the U.S. laws. There's arson and murder and all those other things, but not terrorism. And in fact, if you looked in the case law and the federal laws, you'd see over 84 different definitions of the word terrorism. And so the government really got to pick and choose what it wanted to do. You know, it was the orchestra's conductor, so to speak, and it started to kind of play out what it wanted to play out. And of course, you know, this is after the successful WTO protests. We had growing movements of environmental activists and animal rights activists. All of this was a direct threat to capitalism and was responded to in kind. You know, similarly, if you know your history, the COINTELPRO era of the 60s and 70s, when the Black Panthers and the civil rights movement started to try to change the course of what our moral fabric existed of, they were targeted and repressed and ultimately crushed. And you know, this panel is called Security Culture as part of it. And so part of what I'm going to talk about is some of the tactics that the government has used against activists and some of the tactics that we as activists have to strategize against. We have watched the American Indian movement, the Black Panther movement, the Puerto Rican independence movement, the civil rights movement, the student democratic movement, you know, many movements who were up and coming. They had charismatic leaders, they had a plan, they had a movement behind them. They were all virtually crushed by government repression, by the power of the state. And the government now is using that same playbook that they have used historically over and over. None of their tactics are new. And so if we can look at the tactics that they've used in the past and find a way to dance around them and continue to be effective in the face of government repression, then our movements may hold a standing chance of being able to overcome that. If not, we're looking down a path that has been trodden by many amazing activists beforehand, and the end result is that we're going to find ourselves in an alley with nowhere to go. And we're seeing the beginning start of this. You know, two of my clients, Eric McDavid, a young 20-year-old anarchist from Southern California who was prosecuted for a thought crime. He didn't burn anything down, he didn't even do anything, but an informant infiltrated his friend group and instigated them to build a bomb. There really was never a bomb. She gave them the recipe, she gave them money, she took them to a store and said, we're going to go grocery shopping for bomb ingredients. They were all sort of like, okay, she's kind of weird, but let's go for the ride. And instead the FBI, surrounded them, and he was prosecuted. Now, what do you think the prison sentence would be for a couple of young kids who are mouthy and are talking and haven't actually done anything illegal other than thinking about things and shooting their mouths off, as we may do from time to time with our friends? Wouldn't it be great to take down a dam and restore salmon to the rivers? I mean, we probably all had conversations about how we would love to take down the entire government and put a different one in its place. All of that talk, we normally think is First Amendment and protected and it's private and all of those things, but if you've got a snitch in your midst and their intention is to prosecute people, he got 22 years in prison and sits in prison today. 22 years. Another woman, Marie Mason, another one of my clients, got prosecuted in Michigan. Her ex-husband was the snitch that ratted her out, and she was accused of setting a fire in an animal research facility in a university. She was just sentenced to 20 years in prison. The two things that these folks have in common is non-cooperation. A lot of radical movements have an ethic of non-cooperation with the government. They won't testify at grand juries. They won't snitch on their movements or others. And the government hates that. They really like it when it's easy. They don't want to do any work. They want to investigate crimes. They want to haul you into a dark room and have you confess on all of your comrades so that it's much easier for them to prosecute you. And so in order to attempt to turn that tide, all of a sudden there's all these kids that have been raised up with this ethic and they're not cooperating and they're not snitching. Well, that's not going to work for the government. And so the way they tried to turn that tide is by punishing people with extreme prison sentences for their non-cooperation. Like I said, average prison sentence 2 years. Marie is in prison for 20 years. 16-year-old daughter and a 20-year-old son will probably spend the rest of her life in a prison. And just yesterday, she was transferred to what's called a communication management unit, which is a secret hole that they put political prisoners in so they have no contact with the media and are virtually silenced. Daniel McGowan is another one of my clients who was sent to one of them. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about CMUs, but go on our website, cldc.org, and you can get information on what a CMU is. It's a secret prison. We've got a federal lawsuit going right now that we're trying to have the courts rule them completely unconstitutional. But they're there and they're sending our political prisoners to them. So turning now to some of those tactics that I was mentioning, because as I was asked to speak about security culture and how to continue to do all the great work that absolutely needs to happen without facing the rest of your life in prison. And I guess I'll start by saying, part of the reason that these movements are being targeted is because they were effective. We've got climate change, environmental collapse, food safety issues, mad cow everywhere. Like, some of the issues that these people are fighting for have become quite popular and common. There is no denying that our planet is in dire, dire situations, and that even the next generation may not live the life that we have lived. And time is up. It's time to get off our butts and start, trying to affect some of that change. The corporations, the gazillion-dollar corporations like BP and Monsanto, that means they might lose the gazillions of dollars of profit they make. And so they actually have formed organizations that are drafting model legislation. They come up with laws that then they shop around to legislators. Hey, try to pass this Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and we'll give you $1 million for your campaign funding. And so literally, that's what happened with one law. The pharmaceutical corporations and the fur farms and the vivisectors and whatnot all got together and they drew up this law called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And they bought and paid for it, and Congress passed it. And literally, this is a federal crime of terrorism, that if you hinder the profits of an animal enterprise, a zoo, a puppy mill, a lab, anything that exploits animals, if you hinder their profits and you crossed state lines to do it, you can now be prosecuted as a federal terrorist. And the internet is crossing state lines according to this law. So using the internet to call for a boycott, to give information about mad cow disease, all of that has now been put into this vague law called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And I've got some brochures in the back on more details about that. But that's sort of the stage that we're up against. And so there are 4 primary methods of government repression and infiltration that we've been seeing. And I'll tell you that this information is gathered from the last 10 years of radical activist cases that we've been dealing with. The government puts protective orders over all of the discoveries so that I can't flash a bunch of very scary reports at you on a screen, but all of this information is gleaned from that. So the first issue is infiltration. We've got agents, FBI agents or local police agents, but they can also be private citizens that act as infiltrators, agitators, and provocateurs. What this means is these people are paid to spy on your meetings, to agitate you into doing things that you wouldn't normally do, to report back to the government your political philosophies, your plans, your membership, your financial donors, all sorts of very powerful information for the government to hold on to, and of course also information that was ruled to be unconstitutional during the 60s when COINTELPRO was going on. The 9/11, according to our government, seems to have erased all of that litigation, and now they're back up to the old tricks again. We've had an influx of FBI recruiters on college campuses. Eric McDavid's case that I mentioned, the snitch, Anna, was actually just a college student, and she presented a paper on a protest she went to, and an FBI agent approached her and said, "How'd you like to make $80,000 working for us? Go around campus to all of the meetings, and whatever you hear and see, report back to us over email." And then when she found Eric and friends, they said, "Oh, that's who we want you to get on." And they gave her a bunch of money and told her what to do, and literally she was just a college student before this. And there have been a number of instances where this type of recruitment, particularly of women, has gone on. And so don't think that agents are going to look like cops and are going to be wearing an earpiece or anything like that, because that's not the way it goes. As a matter of fact, the FBI has trained an army of individuals to look like you and I. They have actually instructed and have special camp training type of sessions to make them look like anarchists. Particularly for the RNC and DNC, they've got fake tattoos, they've got the right clothing, they've got the right shoes, they can talk the talk. Because all these snitches have given them tons of information about culture and all these superfluous issues, they have been extremely well trained to model you, which is why they've been so effective in infiltrating you. And you may not even know that your movement has been monitored because you might not be doing anything illegal, but they know about what you're up to, and that's just as harmful in many ways as actually busting people. Now, the other thing that they do is sometimes they want you to know that they're spying on you, because if the public knows that your group is being targeted and your group is being spied upon, good luck finding new members to come join you on the hot seat, right? So it's a way to disenfranchise and disempower marginalized radical groups, even community organizations, but also individuals as well. There's also been a lot of psychological warfare that has gone on. A lot of what they call dirty tricks, fake media articles, fake letters, fake phone messages to people saying, the charismatic leader of your group is actually a snitch, when they're not at all. but the rumor mill gets started, and now that person becomes marginalized and less effective in what they do. The bottom line, people always ask me, how do we know if we've got a stitch in our movement? The bottom line is it's extremely difficult to 100% know whether somebody is an informant or an infiltrator or not. Really, the only way we can 100% know is when the FBI kindly hands us reports telling us so in discovery. Otherwise, for you guys as community activists, it's very, very difficult to know. But the bottom line is, if someone is detracting energy from your group more than contributing, if they're causing a shit show in your organization and in your community, if they are breaking up, dividing your groups, causing fiery debates that seem to disempower people instead of empower them, then chances are they're not a productive contributor to your group, and you might want to be careful of them. If they seem to have no past, you've never met their high school friends, you've never seen their driver's license, all of those things can be evidence that there might be a problem, but no one thing is going to prove to you one way or the other that somebody definitely is. Especially because we're all a little sociologically screwed up in some way, and so just because someone seems to be twisted and weird doesn't mean that they're necessarily a government agent. Though often the two are kind of tied together. We've also seen a lot of harassment through the legal system, keeping people tied up on probation or on release agreements for what used to be really minor charges. Somebody does a blockade and gets arrested for civil disobedience, but now it takes 2 years to get the case to court, and then they end up with 5 years of probation afterward, or they will repeatedly arrest organizers of groups and communities in order to keep the money really tied up in bail and things of that nature. And of course, when you're talking about mass demos, large rallies, RNC, DNC, level of crimes, we have seen peremptory strikes on organizers where, for some reason they still haven't got it through their heads, even though they've heard me say it many times. Most of our movements are not hierarchical like cop shops are and like the FBI is. And so they still think that there is one person that's pulling the strings and puppeteering our entire movements, and if they can arrest that one person, then we will all fall to our knees and sob because we don't know what to do. And so before these big rallies, they will go out and arrest a couple of people that they think are the leaders with the idea that, well, now everyone will go home and WTO won't happen, which of course is not at all the case, but has happened over and over again. Most recently with the I-69 campaign in the Midwest, and if you're not familiar with that, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but in essence, the media people were arrested and prosecuted for felony racketeering charges. For talking about how rural farmers should be able to have their farms instead of a NAFTA superhighway going through the middle of them. And you can Google I-69 campaign and read more about that if you want to. Then the other thing that we're seeing is what we're calling extra legal force. And this is the militarization of our police. I'm sure if you've been to any public demonstrations, you see commando goons in Darth Vader get-ups, or they're wearing military camo. They're carrying like enough power to wipe out a small village. They're coming in what look like tanks, armed personnel carriers, and they are treating everyone, regardless of what they're doing and why they're there, as if they are a personal threat to their life, always. And this has resulted in a few things. Number one, it scares people away. Good luck getting Joe Schmo to come out to your demonstration when he has to walk by 55 armed Darth Vader goons with no faces in order to get his picket sign. Not to mention the media now thinks, wow, well, if these cops are showing up like this, these must be terrorists, because why else would they show up like this? And so there's sort of that branding and stereotyping of the movement and the activities based on this police presence. I represented 27 lovely, young, smiley forest activists who wanted to stop a clear cutting on state forest land in Oregon, and they did a blockade. And they did those usual things where they had the black bears and locked their arms together, and there were 3-to-1 police officers to protester that showed up in the commando gear. We had Oregon National Guard, Oregon State Police, Douglas County Sheriff, and not to mention probably an equal number of undercovers to arrest these kids from a civil disobedience. They left them in cuffs for 10 hours, they dragged them by the shoulder sockets, and it wasn't because they actually had any concern that this was somehow going to be some scary thing. The reason was they wanted to scare these kids and other kids like them from ever engaging in this type of activity again. And they had some joint terrorism task force funds that they wanted to use. And darn it, Roseburg hasn't had a terrorist incident yet, so this was close enough. And so they went out there and did commando play games and did sort of a practice run for themselves on forest protesters. And we reported about that in the media and tried to kind of spin that back the way it should be. But these are, tactics that are being used against us that are making our jobs more difficult to do. The upshot, though, is despite the fact that we've had ball and chains around our necks and we're slogging through mud with all these FBI agents behind us and all their crazy tactics and them trying to sabotage all of our work in the public interest, we have resulted in being incredibly successful nonetheless. I always joke that if we were to wipe out the feds and the FBI and all of this harassment and surveillance, we'd probably already have saved the world. And the fact that we are, making incremental little steps toward at least keeping ourselves alive is probably saying a lot. We probably are extremely effective given all of that crap that is piled upon us. So there's a few obvious surveillance things that I wanted to point out to you. Number one is cell phones. Everybody's cell phone now has a GPS chip in it. It is a locating device. Most cell phones that are smartphones also have a one-way recording capability so that the FBI could simply plug in my cell phone number and listen in on any conversation I had with my cell phone within range. They can also locate me anywhere I am as long as the battery remains in my phone. The only way to turn off this capability is to remove the battery from your phone. And so these little tips apply not only to those people who are plotting the revolution, but also people who used to comprehend this term called privacy. We used to have it in the country. It was like the Fourth Amendment, I think, and it was the right to have your private affairs separated from the state. And if any of you still kind of like that concept a little bit, these steps and these tactics are important for us to maintain, these rights. Because if you don't use them, you lose them. It's sort of like, if you get stopped in your car and they want to search your car, and you say, I don't consent, get a warrant. And they say, well, we can stand on the side of the highway for 4 hours till we get the warrant. Sometimes that's what you got to do. Because if only the guilty stand there and say, go get a warrant, then we've all kind of lost a lot of our rights. They've eroded incredibly since 9/11. But the only way that you get them back or even maintain them is by using them. And so it's important for everybody to know their rights, and it's important to respect privacy and demand privacy even if you yourself have nothing to be afraid of. So that's cell phones. Also, people think, oh, I would know if someone was listening in on my conversation because I'd see the bug or I'd see this earpiece or whatnot. And in our green scare cases, the lead snitch that busted those cases open was a guy named Jake Ferguson. He had a pentagram tattooed on his forehead, and he was a black-clad, crusty, dumpster-diving train hopper. No one ever would have thought that that would become an FBI agent, but he wandered around the country and trapping people and recording them. And he didn't have an earpiece, and he didn't have a microphone that he asked people to talk. It was literally the size of an earring and something that fit into the brim of a baseball hat that was undetectable. So don't think, the other silly tactic is people think, well, if we walk outside and go for a walk, then my conversation might be more secure. No, these listening devices work anywhere. The other thing is pole cameras. They set up a video camera on a street pole outside of your campaign headquarters, your home, your office, whatever it may be, and it's 24/7 video footage of who comes in, who goes out, et cetera, et cetera. Common tactic, but you can kind of look around the poles and figure that one out a little easier than some of the others. The other thing is bugging. You know, people think that they can unscrew their phone and look and see a bug. That's not the case anymore. Most spying, most warrantless spying especially, is now done by waves that are shot into the windows of your home. So by shooting a beam on the window of this church window, they are able to listen to everything that goes on inside. And the same is true with your home. You're not going to be finding little devices. You know, those are old school. And they ran on batteries, so they died and had to be replaced. These don't need any batteries. And like I said, you know, especially with the use of cell phones and things like that, there's no longer a need for that type of technology. So that's the listening stuff. Other things, you know, if a volunteer comes into your group and wants to be the treasurer, the president, the media guy, he wants to run your computers, he's a computer genius and will fix all of your problems, and he seems to always have money for gas and all of these other things, that type of person should probably be looked at with some scrutiny. Only a trusted person should be allowed into your financial records and your membership records and, you know, those key things. Because one of the tactics they do is they will bring in this very effective person, because he's been trained by the FBI, to come in and sort of take over all the crappy jobs that nobody wants to really do in a group, and then they leave after sabotaging your systems, and the group is left not knowing how to do anything anymore. You know, you're paralyzed because the person who did the website, did the computers, did the membership, did everything is now gone, and no one else ever learned how, and maybe they changed your systems completely. So be careful of like the martyr person who wants to be everything to a particular group. Maybe they're not a Fed, but it's a dysfunctional setup to begin with that can be avoided. Sneak and peek searches. I'm sure you've all heard of the Patriot Act, right? It's been around for almost 9 years now. If you don't know what the Patriot Act is, you need to get on the web and do a little research on it. The Patriot Act was passed by George Bush. It was the FBI's wish list. There are many extremely troubling provisions of it. It gutted the Fourth Amendment. It gutted many constitutional amendments. But one of the primary ones that's maybe relevant to this discussion is the provision called the sneak and peek provision. This allows the FBI to enter your home without a warrant. They don't even have to go to the judge and get the rubber stamp on it anymore. They can just go into your home, look in your underwear drawer, download your computer, spy on you, you know, do all sorts of things in your home, and then leave and never tell you they were there. Under our old system, they had to go to a judge and at least give some sniff test of why they were allowed to spy on you. And then after they got done spying on you, they had to leave a notification that they were there, and here's what they took, and here's why they were allowed to be here. Now, no longer the case. If the FBI, you know, deems you to have any information leading to a terrorist investigation, which of course now is saving bunnies from vivisection, they can now do this type of searches on you. It also allowed for nationwide warrants. You know, it used to be that they had to get a warrant in a state and then execute it in that state. Now they can get one in Detroit and come out here to Portland and utilize the warrant without any of our local judges or local law enforcement knowing anything about it. Computers, you know, there's a thing called a pen trace trap, and where they can monitor every keystroke that you type on your computer. So even if you're using PGP and encryption software, if they are monitoring every keystroke on your computer, then they are able to spy on the contents of your computer. Another section of the Patriot Act, Section 216, is grotesque. It forces librarians to give up the books that you check out of a library and the magazines and things that you look at, and they are gagged from ever telling anyone that they've been forced to do this. This was all stuff that George Bush allowed happen, but just in 2009, Obama, after saying that this law was repugnant and had serious concerns, and he told the National Organization of Women he was going to, you know, do everything he could to repeal it. Well, in 2009, he rubber stamped those provisions into they were set to expire in December of '09. They extend it to February because they're not quite sure what they're going to do. And instead of ever having any discussion, debate, analysis, or review of those provisions, they just reauthorized them in late February of 2009 under the Obama administration, including the librarian provision. So Obama's not going to really change anything, in case anyone in this room was hopeful of that. And I think that, you know, there are lawsuits going through the pike, but we're not going to hold our breath for lawsuits to necessarily be successful either. I think, you know, a lot of this change is going to have to happen at the grassroots level if any change is going to be had. But I think the most important thing is to be aware of the landmines that now exist while you're navigating your activism.